They say fire cleanses everything. On Christmas night 1876, in the heart of Georgia, an 11-year-old boy proved that truth in the most terrifying way imaginable. While wealthy white families celebrated inside their mansion, Baltazar, small, scarred and silent, stood outside with a torch in his trembling hands. What happened next would become whispered legend across every plantation in the South. Some called it justice, others called it the devil's work. But everyone agreed on one thing: no one who entered that house that night would ever leave it alive. Antes de eu te contar o que aconteceu depois, se inscreve e ativa o sininho. Essa história fica mais sombria e você não vai querer perder nenhum momento. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on the cotton fields of the Whitmore plantation, turning the red clay earth into something that burned through worn shoes and bare feet alike. Baltazar had stopped feeling the pain years ago. At 11 years old, his hands were already calloused like an old man's, his back marked with scars that told stories he'd never speak aloud. He'd been working these fields since he was six years old, an age when most children should have been playing, learning, growing. Instead, Baltazar had learned different lessons. He'd learned that screaming only made the whip come down harder. He'd learned that looking a white person in the eye could cost you teeth. He'd learned that hope was a luxury enslaved people couldn't afford. Before we continue, if you want to hear more stories like this, stories that need to be told, hit that like button and subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. The Whitmore family owned 200 acres and 47 enslaved people. Master Richard Whitmore was known throughout Carroll County as a respectable gentleman, a churchgoer, a businessman, a family man. His wife, Catherine, hosted elaborate parties where she showed off her fine china and French wines. Their 3 children, Elizabeth, Thomas, and young Margaret, grew up believing that the people who served them were property, no different from the horses in their stable. Baltazar's mother, Sarah, had worked in the big house since before he was born. She was quiet, obedient, and terrified, exactly what the Whitmores demanded. His father, Moses, worked the fields from sunrise to sunset, his spirit broken long before Baltazar could remember. His 2 older brothers, Samuel and Isaiah, had been sold off to a plantation in Alabama. When Baltazar was 7, he still remembered their faces, though the memory grew hazier each year. The boy had learned to make himself invisible. He moved through the big house like a shadow, carrying trays, polishing silver, scrubbing floors. He watched everything with dark eyes that revealed nothing. The Whitmores barely noticed him, which was exactly how he survived. But Baltazar noticed everything. He noticed how Master Whitmore counted his money in the study every Thursday night, the silver key hanging from his vest pocket. He noticed how Mrs. Catherine kept her laudanum bottle in the 3rd drawer of her vanity, taking swigs when she thought no one was watching. He noticed how the house's old wooden frame creaked in the wind, how the kerosene lamps were always filled to the brim, how the doors to the servants' quarters were locked from the outside each night. Most of all, he noticed the cruelty. It was December 1876, and the Whitmores were preparing for their annual Christmas celebration. The big house buzzed with activity, enslaved people cooking, cleaning, decorating. Sarah moved through her duties with practiced efficiency, her movements careful and precise. One mistake could mean punishment. One spilled drink, one broken dish, one moment of clumsiness could result in the whip, the stocks, or worse. Baltazar watched his mother work herself to exhaustion. She was 34, but looked 50, her body worn down by years of labor and fear. Sometimes, late at night in their small cabin, she would cry silently, her thin shoulders shaking. Baltazar would pretend to sleep, knowing there was nothing he could do to comfort her. What words could ease a pain that had no end? The Christmas party was the social event of the season. Dozens of wealthy white families would attend, filling the big house with laughter, music, and the smell of roasted meats and expensive perfumes. For the enslaved people, it meant endless work, serving food, pouring drinks, standing silent, and ready for any command. Baltazar hated the parties most of all. He hated watching these people eat until they were sick, while his own stomach cramped with hunger. He hated their laughter, their casual conversations about business and weather while his people suffered. He hated how they looked through him, as if he were furniture, as if he weren't human at all. But this Christmas would be different. This Christmas, something inside Baltazar had begun to shift. He'd started having dreams, vivid, terrible dreams, where fire consumed everything. He'd wake up sweating, his heart pounding, and for just a moment, he'd feel something other than despair. He'd feel possibility. The boy who never smiled had begun to plan. What moment in history makes you most angry? Drop a comment below and let's talk about the stories we need to remember. Christmas Eve arrived with unusual warmth for December in Georgia. The air hung thick and still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Inside the big house, crystal chandeliers blazed with candlelight, casting dancing shadows across walls papered in expensive damask. The dining room table stretched nearly 20 feet, covered in white linen and laden with silver serving dishes. Baltazar stood in the corner of the room, perfectly still, a pitcher of water in his small hands. Around him, white faces flushed with wine and whiskey, their voices growing louder as the evening progressed. His mother moved between the guests, refilling glasses, removing empty plates, her face carefully blank. Master Whitmore sat at the head of the table, expansive in his expensive suit, holding court with stories of his recent business dealings. Mrs. Catherine, draped in emerald silk that had cost more than most enslaved families would see in a lifetime, laughed at appropriate moments and dabbed at her lips with an embroidered napkin. Their children sat nearby, already learning the casual entitlement of their class. The guests were the cream of Carroll County society, plantation owners, merchants, a local judge, a banker. They discussed cotton prices and politics, complained about difficult labor, and congratulated each other on their prosperity. To them, this was civilization. This was order. This was God's intended hierarchy made manifest in mahogany furniture and fine china. Sarah moved around the table, carrying a crystal decanter of French wine. Her movements were automatic, perfected through years of practice. Refill, Colonel. Morrison's glass. Move to Mrs. Pemberton. Don't make eye contact. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't exist except as a function. She was approaching Mrs. Catherine's seat when it happened. Baltazar never knew exactly what caused it. Perhaps his mother's exhausted body finally betrayed her. Perhaps her hands, worn raw from lye, soap, and endless labor, simply couldn't grip the heavy decanter. Perhaps it was fate, cruel and inevitable. The decanter slipped. Time seemed to slow. Baltazar watched from across the room as deep red wine cascaded down, splashing across Mrs. Catherine's expensive silk dress. The crimson stain spread like blood across the emerald fabric, soaking into the delicate material. The room fell silent. Mrs. Catherine stood slowly, her face transforming from shock to fury. "You clumsy fool!" Her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "This dress came from Paris. Do you have any idea what it cost?" Sarah's face went grey. She dropped to her knees immediately, her voice shaking. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Please, I'm so sorry. It was an accident, I swear." "An accident?" Mrs. Catherine's laugh was sharp and cold. "You've ruined my dress in front of all our guests." She turned to her husband, her voice rising. "Richard, are you going to let her get away with this? This is unacceptable." Master Whitmore's face darkened. The convivial host disappeared, replaced by something harder, colder. He stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. "Take her." "Outside," he said quietly, "to the whipping post." "No!" Sarah's voice broke. "Please, Master, please. It was an accident. I'll work extra. I'll do anything. Please don't." Two white overseers who'd been drinking in the kitchen grabbed Sarah by her arms, dragging her toward the door. She fought desperately, her bare feet sliding across the polished floor. "Please, I'll clean it. I'll fix it. Please, don't do this." Baltazar dropped the water pitcher. It shattered on the floor, but no one noticed. Every eye in the room was on his mother as she was dragged away, her screams echoing through the big house. "Well," Colonel Morrison said, clearing his throat, "shall we have dessert?" The party continued. Baltazar stood frozen, his small body trembling. Around him, white people returned to their conversations, their laughter, their celebration, as if nothing had happened, as if a woman wasn't about to be torn apart by a whip for spilling wine. One of the house girls, an older woman named Essie, grabbed Baltazar's arm. "Come on, child," she whispered urgently. "You can't do nothing. Come away now." But Baltazar pulled free. He walked to the front door on legs that didn't feel like his own. Essie called after him, but he didn't stop. He stepped out onto the wide front porch and into the warm December night. The whipping post stood in the yard, between the big house and the quarters, deliberately positioned where everyone could see. It was thick pine, worn smooth by the bodies that had been tied against it. Master Whitmore believed in public punishment. He said it maintained order, taught lessons, reminded everyone of their place. Baltazar walked down the porch steps and across the yard. Other enslaved people had gathered, forced to watch. It was part of the punishment, making everyone witness the suffering, making them feel their own helplessness. Sarah had been tied to the post, her arms stretched above her head, her dress torn away to expose her back. Master Whitmore stood nearby, holding his favorite whip, 9 feet of braided leather with a lead tip. He'd named it Discipline. "This," Master Whitmore announced loudly, "is what happens when you show disrespect to your betters, when you're careless with your master's property. Let this be a lesson to all of you." The first strike split the night air like thunder. Sarah screamed, her body jerking against the ropes. Baltazar watched. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't look away. He made himself watch every single lash. 10 strikes. 20. Sarah's screams grew weaker. Blood ran down her back, dark in the lamplight. 30. 40. Her body went limp, held up only by the ropes around her wrists. "Please," someone whispered in the crowd. "Please stop, she's had enough." But Master Whitmore continued. 50 lashes. By the end, Sarah wasn't screaming anymore. She wasn't moving at all. "Cut her down," Master Whitmore said finally, breathing hard from the exertion. "And someone clean up this mess. I want to get back to my guests." They untied Sarah, and her body crumpled to the ground like a broken doll. Baltazar ran to her, dropping to his knees in the dirt. Her back was a mass of torn flesh and blood. Her eyes were half open but unseeing. "Mama," he whispered, touching her face with trembling hands. "Mama, please." But Sarah didn't respond. Her chest barely moved, each breath shallow and rattling. They carried her to the quarters, to the small cabin she shared with Moses and Baltazar. The plantation had no doctor for enslaved people. That cost money. They laid Sarah on her thin mattress and tried to clean her wounds with rags and water. But there was too much damage, too much blood loss, and Sarah was already sick, her body weakened by years of exhaustion and poor food. Baltazar sat beside his mother all night, holding her cold hand. Moses knelt on her other side, his face carved from stone, his eyes dry because he'd cried all his tears years ago. As Christmas morning dawned, Sarah took her last breath. Her fingers went slack in Baltazar's grip. The rattle in her chest went silent. She died for spilling wine. Baltazar sat there for a long time, staring at his mother's still face. Something inside him, some last connection to childhood, to innocence, to the belief that things might somehow get better, broke cleanly in two. When he finally stood and walked out of the cabin, he was no longer the boy who'd entered it. His eyes, which had always been watchful and careful, now held something different, something cold and certain and absolutely terrifying in an 11-year-old child. Moses saw it and felt fear touch his heart. "Baltazar," he said quietly, "don't do nothing foolish, son. I can't lose you too." But Baltazar didn't answer. He walked away from the quarters, toward the big house, where the Whitmores were probably just waking up, probably nursing headaches from too much wine, probably already forgetting about the woman they'd killed over a stained dress. He walked past the whipping post, still stained with his mother's blood. He walked past the cotton fields where he'd worked since he was 6 years old. He walked to the tool shed behind the big house and stood there, staring at its locked door. Inside that shed were implements of labor and punishment, shovels and hoes, chains and manacles, and barrels of kerosene for the lamps that lit the big house every night, for the lamps that made it shine like a beacon of civilization in the darkness. Baltazar looked at that shed for a long time. Then he looked back at the big house, where white people slept in soft beds, their stomachs full, their consciences clear. In his mind, he saw his mother's torn back. He saw her dead eyes. He saw his souled brothers. He saw his broken father. He saw the scars on his own small body. He saw every cruelty, every humiliation, every casual violence he'd witnessed in his short, brutal life. And he made a decision. Some wrongs were too great for forgiveness. Some suffering demanded answer. Some fires needed to burn. Would you have the courage Baltazar had? Share your thoughts in the comments. This story isn't over yet. The day after Christmas passed in strange stillness. The Whitmore household recovered from their celebration. Servants quietly removed decorations, and life on the plantation returned to its routine of exploitation and misery. Sarah's body was buried in an unmarked grave in the corner of the property where enslaved people were laid to rest. Her funeral, consisting of a few whispered prayers and tears that had to be hidden from white eyes. Master Whitmore never mentioned the incident again. Why would he? To him it was finished, a necessary correction, nothing more. The stained dress had been discarded, a replacement already ordered from Atlanta. The evening's unpleasantness was forgotten as easily as last week's weather. But Baltazar remembered everything. He moved through his duties like a ghost, emptying chamber pots, scrubbing floors, carrying firewood. The house slaves whispered about him, worried by his silence. Before he'd been quiet but present. Now he seemed hollow, as if the essential part of him had departed with his mother's last breath. Only his eyes betrayed the truth. They burned with something that frightened the adults who saw them. A terrible clarity, a fixed purpose that had no place in a child's face. Baltazar began to watch the big house differently. No longer just noting routines and schedules. He studied the building's vulnerabilities with the focused intensity of a general planning a campaign. He observed which floorboards creaked loudest, which windows stuck in their frames, which doors swelled with humidity and became difficult to open. He paid particular attention to the kerosene supply. Every evening, enslaved workers refilled the lamps throughout the big house, dozens of them, burning bright to chase away the darkness that pressed against the windows. The kerosene was stored in the tool shed, 5 large barrels of it, enough to keep the mansion illuminated for months, enough to turn the entire structure into an inferno. On December 28th, Baltazar volunteered to fill the evening lamps. The house slaves exchanged glances. The boy rarely volunteered for anything, but they were grateful for the help. Essie, the older woman who'd tried to pull him away during his mother's whipping, watched him carefully. "You all right, child?" she asked gently as Baltazar lifted the heavy kerosene container. "Yes'm," he replied, his voice flat. "Your mama's in a better place now, no more suffering." Baltazar nodded, but said nothing. He didn't believe in better places. He'd seen too much to believe in anything except what he could see and touch and break. He moved through the big house, filling each lamp with careful precision. But as he worked, he also began to memorize something else: the layout, the escape routes, the places where fire would spread fastest. The big house was a tinderbox. Built before the Civil War, its wooden frame had aged and dried for decades. The summer heat had baked it, winter cold had split its boards, and time had created 1,000 small cracks and gaps where air could flow and flames could race. The walls were lined with expensive fabrics, curtains, tapestries, upholstered furniture, all of it ready to burn. Baltazar saw it all with new eyes. The grand staircase in the center hall would become a chimney, drawing flames upward. The wallpaper, expensive and imported, was held in place with paste that would ignite beautifully. The oriental rugs scattered throughout were thick with years of dust and oils. Even the Christmas decorations still adorning some rooms, pine branches and ribbon, would catch and spread flame from room to room. It was perfect. That night, Baltazar didn't sleep. He lay in the cabin he'd shared with his parents, listening to his father's ragged breathing in the darkness. Moses had aged years in the past few days, his spirit crushed under a grief too heavy to bear. He'd stopped speaking, except when directly addressed, stopped eating except when forced. Baltazar understood. His father had already been broken. Sarah's death had simply completed a process begun long ago. Moses would work until he died, probably within the year, and his death would matter to no one except the Whitmores, who would note the financial loss in their ledger books. The boy rose silently and walked to the small wooden box where his mother had kept her few possessions. A cracked mirror, a button that had fallen from some white person's coat, a smooth stone from a river she'd probably never see again, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a tinderbox, flint, steel, and charred fabric for catching sparks. Baltazar took the tinderbox and held it, feeling its weight in his palm. His mother had used this to light cooking fires, to bring warmth and light to their small cabin. He would use it for something else entirely. The next day, December 29th, was a Sunday. Master Whitmore insisted all enslaved people attend the plantation church service, where a white preacher explained how God intended their bondage, how suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next, how obedience to earthly masters pleased the Lord. Baltazar sat in the back with the other enslaved children, not hearing a word. He was calculating distances and timing. He was thinking about locked doors and windows. He was planning murder. After the service, the Whitmores hosted Sunday dinner for several families. The big house filled again with white voices and white laughter, with the clinking of silverware and crystal glasses. Baltazar served them, invisible and silent, watching as they ate food his people had grown and cooked, but would never taste. He watched Elizabeth Whitmore, 16 years old, giggling with her friends about some boy from Carrollton. He watched Thomas Whitmore, 13, bragging about the rifle his father had given him for Christmas. He watched little Margaret, only 8, demanding more cake with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never been denied anything. These children had never known hunger. They'd never known fear. They'd never watched their mother die in the dirt. Baltazar felt nothing for them. No hatred, no anger, just a cold recognition that they were part of the same system that had killed Sarah, that had sold his brothers, that scarred his back. They were beneficiaries of cruelty, and intention didn't matter, innocence didn't matter. Their comfort was built on suffering, and that debt had come due. That evening, after the guests departed and the Whitmores retired to their rooms, Baltazar completed his final duties. He helped clear the dining room, wash the dishes, bank the cooking fires. He moved efficiently, drawing no attention, just another small enslaved boy doing what he was told. When Essie finally dismissed him around 9 o'clock, he walked toward the quarters with the other house slaves. But in the darkness, he slipped away. No one noticed. Why would they? He was nobody, nothing, just another piece of property. Baltazar circled back to the big house, keeping to the shadows. The building glowed with lamplight, every window golden against the night. He could see movement inside, the Whitmores preparing for bed, house slaves completing final tasks. He made his way to the tool shed. The padlock was old but functional, designed to keep enslaved people from accessing tools that could be weapons or aids to escape. But Baltazar was small and determined, and the shed's walls had gaps between the boards. It took him 15 minutes to work loose a plank near the back, creating an opening just wide enough for his thin body to squeeze through. Inside, the shed smelled of oil and rust and old wood. Baltazar's eyes adjusted to the darkness, making out shapes, barrels, tools, coils of rope. He found what he needed, a large tin bucket and one of the kerosene barrels. His small arms shook as he tilted the heavy barrel, pouring kerosene into the bucket. The sharp smell filled his nose, made his eyes water. He filled the bucket half full, then stoppered the barrel and returned it to its place. He couldn't lift the bucket and squeeze back through the gap, so he pushed the bucket through first, then followed. Outside again, Baltazar picked up the bucket and began walking toward the big house. It was 10 o'clock now, late enough that most lights in the quarters had been extinguished, early enough that a few lamps still burned in the big house. His heart pounded, but his hands were steady. He felt calm, clearer than he'd ever felt in his life. This was right. This was justice. This was the only language these people understood. The kitchen entrance at the rear of the big house was unlocked. It always was, to allow early morning workers access. Baltazar slipped inside, moving silently through the familiar space. The kitchen was dark and empty, the cooking fire reduced to embers in the hearth. He paused, listening. Upstairs, floorboards creaked as someone moved between rooms. A door closed softly. Then silence settled over the house like a blanket. Baltazar set down his bucket and pulled out his mother's tinderbox. His hands trembled now, not with fear, but with anticipation. He struck the flint against the steel once, twice. Sparks flew. The third strike caught, and a small flame bloomed on the charred fabric. The child knelt in the darkness of his master's kitchen, holding fire in his small hands, and smiled for the first time since his mother died. The point of no return has arrived. What would you do in Baltazar's place? Comment below, and brace yourself for what comes next. The flame in Baltazar's hands seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat, casting dancing shadows across the kitchen walls. For a moment, he simply stared at it, mesmerized by its beauty and terrible promise. Such a small thing, hardly bigger than a candle flame, yet containing within it the power to reduce his prison to ash. He had to move carefully now. Smoke would alert anyone still awake, and he needed time. Time for the fire to grow beyond stopping. Time for the flames to spread through the old wooden structure. Time to ensure that when people finally woke and realized what was happening, it would already be too late. Baltazar began in the kitchen, splashing kerosene along the base of the walls, soaking into the wooden floor. The liquid darkened the pine boards, creating a path that would burn like a fuse. He worked methodically, his small form moving from corner to corner until half the bucket was empty. Then he moved into the dining room, where just hours ago white people had laughed and eaten, while his mother lay dead in a pine box. The long table gleamed in the darkness, its surface polished to mirror brightness. Fine china sat in locked cabinets. Silver serving pieces rested on the sideboard, waiting for the next dinner. Party. Baltazar splashed kerosene across the expensive carpets, the upholstered chairs, the velvet curtains that framed the tall windows. The chemical smell grew stronger, sharp and acrid. His eyes watered, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The front hallway came next, with its grand staircase ascending to the second floor where the Whitmores slept in their comfortable beds. Baltazar stood at the base of those stairs for a long moment, looking up into the darkness above. Up there, in rooms. He'd cleaned 1,000 times. The family that owned him dreamed peaceful dreams. They would wake to nightmare. He began climbing the stairs, the bucket lighter now, sloshing with each step. The old wood creaked beneath his feet, but the sound was familiar, just another settling noise in a house full of them. On the second-floor landing, he paused, listening. From Master and Mrs. Whitmore's bedroom at the end of the hall came the sound of snoring. The children's rooms were dark and silent. A single lamp burned low in the hallway, its flame steady and innocent. Baltazar moved to the children's rooms first. Elizabeth's door stood slightly ajar, and through the gap he could see her sleeping form, her blonde hair spread across her pillow. In the next room, Thomas lay sprawled across his bed, one arm hanging off the mattress. Little Margaret slept curled into a ball, clutching a rag doll that one of the enslaved women had made for her. The boy stood in those doorways, watching them sleep. They looked peaceful, innocent even, But Baltazar remembered his mother's torn back, remembered his father's broken eyes, remembered his own scars, and his souled brothers, and every casual cruelty he'd endured at the hands of their family. No mercy. He splashed kerosene at each threshold, creating pools of liquid that would ignite and block the doorways. Then he moved to the master bedroom and did the same, pouring the last of his bucket across their expensive carpet, the liquid soaking deep into the fibers. The bucket was empty now. Baltazar set it down silently and walked back to the staircase. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst from his chest, but his breathing stayed steady. His hands didn't shake. At the base of the stairs, he struck the flint and steel again. Sparks flew, caught. The small flame bloomed once more in his hands. Baltazar touched the burning cloth to a kerosene-soaked curtain in the dining room. The fire didn't explode into life like in stories. Instead, it began almost gently, a small flame licking along the fabric, tasting it, finding it good. Then the flame grew, climbing the curtain with increasing hunger. Within seconds, fire raced up the wall, spreading across the ceiling, reaching for more fuel. Baltazar moved to the hallway and lit another kerosene trail. This one caught faster, flames running along the floor like liquid light, climbing the base of the grand staircase. The fire found the wooden banister and embraced it, racing upward toward the second floor. In the kitchen, he lit a third fire, and this one found the kerosene he'd spread earlier. Flames shot across the floor, consuming the old wood with eager, crackling sounds. 3 fires, burning in 3 different parts of the house, all growing stronger by the second. Baltazar walked to the kitchen door and stepped outside into the December night. The air felt shockingly cold and clean after the chemical smell of kerosene and growing smoke. He turned and looked back at the big house. Already golden light flickered in the windows. Already smoke was beginning to seep through cracks in the walls, rising into the still night air. Baltazar sat down on the back steps and waited. Inside, the fires fed and grew. The flames climbed walls, consumed furniture spread across ceilings. Old wood, dried by decades, burned eagerly. The expensive fabrics and thick carpets created dense smoke that rolled through the rooms in choking clouds. The house itself seemed to moan as the fire spread through its bones. It was the smoke that woke them. Master Whitmore jerked awake, choking, his eyes burning. For a moment, confused by sleep, he couldn't understand what was happening. Then he smelled it, smoke, thick and acrid, filling his bedroom. And he saw the orange glow beneath his door, flames already licking at the threshold. "Catherine!" he shouted, shaking his wife awake. "Fire! The house is on fire!" Mrs. Whitmore screamed, a high, terrible sound. They threw back the covers and ran to their door. Master Whitmore grabbed the handle and yanked it open. Heat and smoke blasted into the room, driving them back. The hallway was an inferno. Flames covered the walls, the ceiling racing toward their bedroom with terrifying speed. "The windows!" Master Whitmore shouted. They ran to the windows and struggled to open them, but the frames had swelled with humidity over the years and stuck fast. Master Whitmore grabbed a chair and smashed it through the glass. Cold air rushed in, feeding the fire, which roared louder. "The children!" Mrs. Catherine screamed. "Richard, the children!" Down the hall, Elizabeth had woken to find her room filling with smoke. She tried to open her door, but flames blocked the threshold, fire climbing her doorframe. She screamed for her parents, for help, for anyone. Thomas woke choking, couldn't see through the smoke, stumbled toward what he thought was his door, but was actually his closet. He collapsed there, gasping for air that wasn't there. Little Margaret never woke at all. The smoke took her in her sleep, a mercy she'd never granted anyone else. The fire consumed the second floor with ruthless efficiency. The grand staircase had become a chimney, flames roaring up it like a river flowing backward. The heat was so intense that windows began exploding outward, glass raining down into the yard. Outside, enslaved people had begun emerging from the quarters, drawn by the light and sound. They stood in their Nightclothes watching the big house burn, faces illuminated by the golden glow. Some cried out in alarm, some stood silent, some, if they were honest, felt something else entirely. Something they'd never admit aloud, something that tasted like justice. Baltazar sat on the kitchen steps and watched them all. Watched the house burn, watched the white faces appear at windows, screaming for help that wouldn't come. Watched as his masters realized they were going to die. Moses found his son sitting there, bathed in firelight, and understood immediately what had happened. He stood beside Baltazar, saying nothing, his hand resting on the boy's small shoulder. Father and son watched the big house burn together. Master Whitmore tried to jump from his second-floor window, driven by desperation and terror. He hit the ground wrong and broke both legs, the bones snapping audibly. He lay in the dirt, screaming, unable to move as fire rained down around him. The flames found him eventually, crawling across the ground like living things, and his screams changed pitch, became something inhuman. Mrs. Catherine didn't try to jump. She stood at her broken window, illuminated by the fire behind her, her expensive nightgown catching flame. She burned standing up, a pillar of fire where a woman had been. The children's screams lasted longest, though not as long as anyone who heard them would wish. Their cries cut through the night, sharp and terrible, until one by one they fell silent. The big house collapsed inward around 3 a.m, the roof caving in with a roar of sparks and flame that shot into the night sky like fireworks. The walls followed, the grand structure reduced to a pile of burning timber and ash and melted silver and the bones of the family that had lived there. Baltazar watched it all. He felt no joy, no satisfaction, no regret. He felt empty, cleansed, as if the fire had burned something out of him along with the house. His mother was still dead. His brothers were still sold. His father was still broken, but the people who'd done those things were dead now too, and that was something. As dawn broke gray and cold over Georgia, enslaved people stood in clusters around the smoking ruins, talking in low, frightened voices. What would happen now? Would the overseer take over? Would they be sold? Would someone come seeking vengeance for what had happened? But Baltazar knew something they didn't. He knew that houses burn all the time, especially old ones, especially ones lit by dozens of kerosene lamps every night. He knew that accidents happen, that tragic fires consume families while they sleep, that sometimes there's no one to blame except fate or God or bad luck. He'd been careful. He'd left no evidence. The kerosene bucket had burned in the fire. The tinderbox was buried deep in the quarters. The loosened board in the tool shed could have been that way for years. When the sheriff came from Carrollton later that morning, Baltazar stood with the other enslaved children and cried convincingly. He told the sheriff he'd been sleeping in the quarters, that he'd woken to shouting and fire, that he'd been too scared to do anything but watch. The sheriff, looking at the small, scarred child with tear tracks on his face, patted his head and told him not to worry. Accidents happen after all. Justice or murder? Heroism or horror? Share what you really think in the comments. One chapter remains, the aftermath no one talks about. The ruins of the Whitmore plantation smoldered for 3 days, sending a column of grey smoke into the winter sky that could be seen for miles. Enslaved people from neighboring plantations whispered about it in the fields, their voices low and careful. White families throughout Carroll County spoke of the tragedy in hustentar novamente continua editard tones, shaking their heads at the terrible misfortune that had befallen such a respectable family. The official investigation concluded within a week. Sheriff Morrison, a man who'd shared many dinners at the Whitmore table, examined the charred remains and declared it an accidental fire, likely caused by a knocked-over lamp or faulty chimney flue. Such tragedies were common enough in houses lit by kerosene and heated by fireplaces. The Whitmores were buried in the White Cemetery in Carrollton, their graves marked with expensive headstones that praised their character and lamented their untimely deaths. No one investigated too closely. No, one wanted to imagine alternatives. The Whitmore estate fell into legal chaos. Distant relatives from Atlanta came to claim what remained: the land, the surviving livestock, and the 47 human beings whose labor had built the family's wealth. An auction was scheduled for February, where everything would be sold to settle debts and distribute inheritance. For 2 months, the enslaved people of the Whitmore plantation existed in a strange limbo. The overseer, a man named Dalton, took temporary control but lacked the authority or resources to maintain the operation. Work continued, but loosely, without the rigid structure that had defined their lives. Some people began to hope, foolishly perhaps, that this disruption might lead to freedom or at least better circumstances. Baltazar said nothing during this time. He worked when told to work, ate the meager rations provided, and spoke only when absolutely necessary. The other enslaved people watched him differently now, though none could articulate exactly why. There was something about the boy that had changed, something in his eyes that made adults look away uncomfortably. Moses watched his son with the quiet desperation of a man who'd lost everything except the one thing he couldn't bear to lose. He saw the coldness in Baltazar's face, the absence of anything resembling childhood, and he grieved for losses that went beyond Sarah's death. His son had become something else on that December night, something hard and unreachable. "You got to let it go," Moses whispered to Baltazar one evening as they sat in their cabin. "You got to find some peace, son, or this hate will eat you alive." Baltazar looked at his father with eyes that seemed decades older than his 11 years. "Peace?" he said quietly. "They killed Mama over spilled wine, and you want me to find peace?" "I want you to survive," Moses replied, his voice breaking. "I want you to make it through this life, even if it's hard, even if it ain't fair. I can't lose you too." "You already did," Baltazar said, and the truth of it hung between them like smoke. In February, the auction took place. Enslaved people were lined up in the cold, examined like livestock, their teeth checked, their bodies assessed for strength and health. Families that had existed for generations were torn apart as individuals were sold to different buyers. Baltazar and Moses were purchased together by a plantation owner from Alabama named Harrison, a man known for working his enslaved people to early graves. They left Georgia on a cold morning, part of a coffle of 15 people chained together for the long walk west. Baltazar looked back once at the blackened ruins of the big house, still visible on the horizon, and felt nothing. That chapter was closed, another was beginning, but the story didn't end there. Stories never truly end. They transform, they spread, they take on lives of their own. And the story of what happened at the Whitmore plantation on Christmas night, 1876, began to change almost immediately. It started with whispers in the quarters of neighboring plantations, enslaved people who'd seen the fire, who'd watched it burn with an intensity that seemed almost deliberate, who'd noticed the strange timing and completeness of the destruction. They didn't speak openly, that would be dangerous, but in the secret spaces where enslaved people could talk freely, theories emerged. Some said they'd seen a small figure near the big house before the fire started. Some said the fire had begun in multiple places at once, which seemed strange for an accident. Some said there was a smell of kerosene stronger than normal, as if someone had spilled extra fuel. And some said they'd seen young Baltazar sitting calmly outside while the house burned, watching without fear or alarm, as if he'd known exactly what was coming. These whispers spread along the invisible networks that connected enslaved communities across the South, carried by hired-out workers, by enslaved people sold and moved to new plantations, by the careful conversations that happened when white people weren't listening. The story traveled from Georgia to Alabama, from Alabama to Mississippi, from Mississippi to Louisiana, changing slightly with each telling. By the time it reached New Orleans 6 months later, it had become something more than a fire. It had become legend. They said a boy named Baltazar, no more than 11 years old, had watched his mother whipped to death for spilling wine. They said he'd waited until Christmas night, when his masters celebrated their wealth and privilege, and then he'd burned them alive in their beds. They said he'd shown no mercy to children or women, that he'd sat outside and listened to their screams with a smile on his face. They said he was an angel of vengeance, a demon of retribution, a warning to every master who thought their cruelty would go unanswered forever. The white community heard versions of the story too, and it terrified them in ways they couldn't quite articulate. The idea that a child, a boy they'd have dismissed as harmless, as property, as beneath notice, could plan and execute such devastating revenge challenged every assumption their society was built upon. If enslaved people could strike back so brutally, if even children could become weapons, then what safety did anyone have? Some plantation owners increased security, added more patrols, locked doors more carefully. Some preached longer sermons about Christian forgiveness and accepting one's lot in life. Some simply refused to believe the story was anything more than rumor and exaggeration. But Baltazar became a name whispered in slave quarters across the South. When masters were cruel, when overseers were violent, when the weight of bondage seemed unbearable, enslaved people would tell each other about the boy who'd burned down the big house with everyone inside, about the child who'd answered suffering with fire. It gave some people hope, dangerous hope perhaps, but hope nonetheless. It gave others nightmares, imagining what might happen if that spirit of vengeance spread. And it gave white families a new fear to add to all their other fears about the people they'd enslaved. The real Baltazar, meanwhile, worked in the cotton fields of Alabama, his hands bleeding, his back acquiring new scars. Harrison was exactly as brutal as his reputation suggested, a man who believed that enslaved people were investments to be used up and replaced, not human beings to be maintained. The work was endless and backbreaking. The food was inadequate, and people died with alarming regularity. Moses lasted 8 months before his body simply gave out. He collapsed in the field one July afternoon, his heart stopping under the weight of grief and exhaustion and heat. He was 42 years old. They buried him in an unmarked grave, and Harrison noted the financial loss in his account books. Baltazar didn't cry at his father's grave. He'd cried all his tears on the night his mother died. Now he just felt empty, hollowed out, like a burned house with nothing left inside but ash. He continued working, continued surviving, because that's what he did. He grew taller, his child's body slowly transforming into something harder and more capable. He learned to hide what he was thinking, to show white people only what they wanted to see: obedience, deference, the appearance of acceptance. But inside, the fire never went out. Other enslaved people on Harrison's plantation knew there was something different about Baltazar. They saw it in the way he looked at the overseer, in the careful way he assessed buildings and routines, in the cold calculation behind his eyes. The older people warned the younger ones to stay away from him, that he carried something dangerous, something that would get people killed. They were right to be afraid. Baltazar was planning again. In 1879, when Baltazar was 14, Harrison's barn burned down overnight, along with an entire season's worth of stored cotton. The fire started mysteriously, spreading too fast for anyone to stop, destroying thousands of dollars worth of crops and equipment. Harrison was financially ruined, forced to sell his plantation and most of his enslaved people to cover his debts. No one could prove anything. Fires happened. Accidents occurred. Baltazar was sold to a plantation in Mississippi. Within a year, that plantation's cotton gin mysteriously burned. He was sold again to Louisiana. That owner's supply shed caught fire, destroying tools and supplies worth hundreds of dollars. A pattern emerged, though it took years for anyone to notice. Wherever Baltazar went, fire followed. Not immediately. He was too smart for that. He'd worked for months, sometimes over a year, establishing himself as reliable and unremarkable. Then something would burn, always at night, always devastating, always impossible to prove as Anything but terrible luck. He never targeted the slave quarters, never endangered the people he lived among. His fires were precise, calculated to hurt owners without harming the enslaved. Sometimes other enslaved people suspected, but they never said anything. Why would they? If Baltazar was burning down the structures of their bondage, more power to him. The legend grew. Stories about the boy who'd burned the Whitmore plantation merged with rumors about the fires that seemed to follow a young man named Baltazar. Enslaved people across the South told their children about him, sometimes as a warning about the consequences of violence, sometimes as a hero story about resistance and revenge. White plantation owners who heard the rumors dismissed them as superstitious nonsense, but some, late at night, remembered the Whitmore family burning in their beds and checked their lamp oil supplies and made sure their doors were locked. Baltazar himself never spoke about any of it. He worked. He survived. And occasionally, when the cruelty became too much or the memory of his mother's death grew too vivid, he struck matches in the dark. In 1883, when he was 18, the Civil War's aftermath was still reshaping the South. Reconstruction had ended, Jim Crow was rising, and former enslaved people found themselves trapped in new systems of oppression nearly as brutal as slavery itself. Baltazar, legally free but functionally trapped by sharecropping debt and racial terror, continued his quiet war. He moved through Louisiana, then Texas, hiring himself out for agricultural work, moving on before anyone could track patterns. And wherever he went, fires followed, always targeting white-owned property, always mysterious in origin, always devastating. Some people called him a terrorist, some called him a freedom fighter, some called him a legend. Some insisted he didn't exist at all, that he was just a story enslaved people told themselves to feel less powerless. But in the quarters and sharecropping cabins, in the secret spaces where black people could speak freely, mothers told their children about Baltazar, about the boy who'd watched his mother die and decided that suffering demanded answer, about the child who'd learned that fire cleanses everything. They told the story as warning and inspiration, as horror and hope. They told it because it was true, even when the details shifted and changed. They told it because sometimes the powerless need to believe that resistance is possible, that cruelty will be answered, that 11-year-old boys can become angels of vengeance. The real Baltazar, if he still existed, if the years of violence and trauma hadn't consumed him entirely, disappeared from record in 1885. Some said he was killed by white vigilantes who'd finally connected the fires to the quiet black man who moved from place to place. Some said he went north during the Great Migration, disappearing into the growing black communities of Chicago or Detroit. Some said he never stopped burning things down. The ruins of the Whitmore plantation remained visible for decades, a blackened scar on the Georgia landscape that locals avoided after dark. People claimed to hear screams coming from the site on Christmas nights, though that was probably just wind and imagination. The property was eventually cleared and sold, but buildings constructed there never seemed to last. They'd burn down or fall apart or simply be abandoned as cursed. In the 1920s, a black church was built near the old Whitmore site. The congregation included descendants of people who'd been enslaved there, and they knew the stories. They never spoke them aloud to white people, but among themselves they remembered. They remembered Sarah, dead for spilling wine. They remembered Baltazar, the child who'd answered cruelty with fire. They remembered that justice sometimes comes not from courts or laws or divine intervention, but from the hands of the desperate and the broken. The church eventually placed a small, unofficial marker in the woods near where the big house had stood. It didn't name Baltazar. That would have been dangerous even decades later. Instead, it simply read, "Remember those who suffered, remember those who resisted, remember that fire cleanses everything." Today, historians debate whether Baltazar actually existed or was a composite figure, a legend built from multiple acts of resistance and slave rebellion. They point out that records are sparse, that Names were often changed or lost, that stories of resistance were suppressed by white historians who preferred narratives of passive victimhood. But in black communities across the South, in family histories passed down through generations, in the collective memory of a people who survived unimaginable cruelty, Baltazar remains real. He remains a reminder that even children can become warriors when pushed too far, that resistance takes many forms, that sometimes the only power the powerless have is the power to destroy. The story of the Whitmore fire, whether exactly as told or embellished by time and telling, serves a purpose. It reminds us that slavery wasn't a system of willing participants and contented workers, as lost cause mythology would suggest. It was a system of violence, maintained by terror, resisted by any means available. It reminds us that the enslaved weren't passive victims waiting for white saviors. They were human beings who fought back however they could, through subtle resistance, through escape, through rebellion, and yes, sometimes through fire. And it reminds us that history is written by survivors, and sometimes the most important stories are the ones that make us uncomfortable, that force us to confront what human beings will do to each other and what human beings will do to survive. Baltazar's story, whether entirely true or partially legend, is one of thousands of resistance stories that have been erased, dismissed, or forgotten. Every enslaved person who ran away, who sabotaged equipment, who slowed work, who poisoned masters, who fought back in large ways or small, was part of the same struggle. Baltazar just became the symbol, the legend, the story that encapsulated all that rage and pain and desperate courage. So whether there was really a boy named Baltazar who burned the Whitmore plantation on Christmas night in 1876, or whether he's an amalgamation of resistance and revenge, his story matters. It matters because it tells a truth that comfortable history tries to hide, that the enslaved never accepted their bondage, that they fought back constantly, and that sometimes that fight was brutal and terrible and absolutely necessary. Fire cleanses everything. It destroys the old to make way for the new. It's painful and terrifying and beautiful all at once. And sometimes, when systems of oppression become too entrenched to dismantle peacefully, fire is all that's left. That's the legend of Baltazar. That's the story that enslaved people told each other in the dark, that gave them hope and fear in equal measure, that reminded them they were human beings capable of resistance and revenge. That's the story that still matters today, whenever we face systems of injustice that seem too big to fight, too powerful to resist. Baltazar reminds us that power isn't always where we think it is, that the overlooked and dismissed can become dangerous, that 11-year-old boys with matches can change the world, and most importantly, he reminds us that those who profit from cruelty should never sleep too soundly, because somewhere in the darkness, someone is striking a match. Someone is remembering their dead. Someone is planning fire. This is history they don't teach in schools. These are the stories that make us uncomfortable because they force us to confront what slavery really was and what resistance really looked like. Share this story. Remember Baltazar. Remember Sarah. Remember all the names we'll never know, all the fires that burned in the night, all the small acts of defiance that added up to survival. Drop a comment with your thoughts on this brutal chapter of history and subscribe so you never miss the stories that need to be told.